Welcome to the second video on ancient Egypt. In this video, we are going to examine prehistoric Egypt and pre-dynastic Egypt. That is, before the time of the pharaohs, which started roughly around 3100 BC. Now, there's evidence that points to human activity in Egypt as far back as 50,000 years ago. And there's even some more evidence that shows that might go back as far back as 200,000 years ago. So we are dealing with extreme periods of time here. And of course, this is during the Stone Age and before written history. So archaeology has to do much of the work to examine these time periods. Now, during these time periods, humans lived a very nomadic lifestyle. They were hunter-gatherers. That is, they had to hunt or gather their food. And when I say gather, I'm talking about small items such as berries or nuts, because they really didn't have a system of planting crops or even storing food for long periods of time. Now, it's around 12,000 to 10,000 BC, and this is around the end of the Ice Age, that the first traces of agriculture begin to show up around the world and Egypt. And again, this isn't unique to the area around Egypt. This occurred in the three first major civilizations. That is the Indus Valley, Mesopotamia, and ancient Egypt. And again, we see this movement away from hunter-gathering to the development of agriculture. And what does that mean? That brings people together. It is food that actually brings people together. We are becoming more social. So you'll see some of the first villages prop up. That will lead to more towns and eventually major cities. So it is food that actually, again, that brings us together. And that also means that we're not living this nomadic lifestyle. That is, we're not roaming all around to hunt and gather for our food. We are living more of a stationary lifestyle. That is, we're planting and storing food. We're actually starting to think about the future. And of course, with this movement towards agriculture comes improvements in technology. And what we see is stone tools are gradually replaced by metalworking. And that occurs roughly between 6,000 and 3,300 BC. And so we see stone tools being replaced by bronze tools and then eventually iron-based tools. After 5500 BC, we move into pre-dynastic Egypt, and that's a rather long period that lasts roughly from 5500 BC all the way up to the first pharaohs in 3100 BC. Now, during this period, Egypt was divided into two main regions, Upper and Lower Egypt, and they had very distinct differences. They had different gods, and they even had different physical characteristics, and that has been confirmed through archaeology. But they had one big connection, and that was the Nile River, and that ran from north to south in Egypt. Now, during this time, writing existed, but there are very few examples of that. So most of the research on this time period has focused on pottery and grave sites, and that's very similar to ancient Greece in terms of the Mycenaean time period. Most of what we know is through the examination of grave shafts and pottery. Because again, this is really before written history. Now, during this time period, we see a greater use of agriculture, a higher degree of craftsmanship, both in pottery and jewelry making. And so both areas, both Upper and Lower Egypt, are starting to develop civilizations. Now, many burials have been discovered, indicating that even in this time period, there was a belief in the afterlife. So it wasn't just relegated to the pharaohs, there was a belief in the afterlife even during this time period. Now, some of the earliest hieroglyphs have been found in Egypt as far back as 3400 BC. So again, that even predates the pharaohs. So it is apparent that the precursors to the pharaohs had a writing system that was in place. Now, before we get to a map of Lower and Upper Egypt, let's take a look at a satellite photo of northern Africa. And this satellite image is actually provided by NASA, so thank you, NASA. Now you can see here that the Sahara Desert consumes almost all of northern Africa. It stretches from the western coast of Africa all the way to the Red Sea, and the only green areas are located in the coastal regions. And then, of course, there is the Nile River. So pretty much Egypt is all Sahara Desert except for the Nile River. So pretty much the Nile acts as a lifeline to Egypt, cutting right through the middle of the Sahara Desert. Now, if we take a look at this photo of the Nile, This is pretty much typical of the Nile River. You have greenery right near the river, and then just a short distance away you have a total changeover to the desert. And so that's quite a stark contrast, as you can see. Okay, so let's take a look at a map of Upper and Lower Egypt. Now the first thing you might ask is, why is Lower Egypt in the north and Upper Egypt in the south? Shouldn't that be reversed? And the answer to that is the ancient Egyptians didn't have a concept of north and south the way we think of it today. They viewed directions in terms of which way the river flowed. And so Upper Egypt is named because the Nile flows this way upstream, and the Nile flows downstream in this direction. And so that is why Lower Egypt is named the way it is. Now here is Lower Egypt, and here is the area that made up Upper Egypt. And you can see these regions are very different topographically. Lower Egypt was called the Black Land, and that was because of these rich deposits that were left by the Nile flooding. And so these rich deposits made Lower Egypt a very fertile area, and so it was relatively easy to grow crops. And so ancient Egypt really never had much of a food problem. Now, as you can see here, the Nile fans out into what's called the Nile Delta, and then that eventually reaches the Mediterranean. And because this land was so fertile, it was highly sought after later on, especially by the Romans, who liked to receive their grain supply from ancient Egypt. Now, Upper Egypt, as I said, was very different topographically. As you can see, this is the open desert, but the lifeline was the Nile, which provided sustenance to the people living during that time period in Upper Egypt. Now, there are a couple of large oases in Upper Egypt. You can see an oasis here and another one right here, so it wasn't a complete barren wasteland. Now, when we talk about Upper Egypt, we must talk about the three deserts, and they are carved out by the Nile. So you can see right here is the Nubian Desert. This area on the map right here is the Western Desert, and the desert to the east of the Nile is called the Eastern Desert. And the Eastern Desert goes right up to the Red Sea. Now, each kingdom had their own ceremonial crown, and they had a huge significance. The king in Upper Egypt wore the white crown, and the king from Lower Egypt wore the red crown. And these crowns will continue to play a very important role after the unification of the two kingdoms. Now, it didn't stop there. The two regions also had other differences as well, and we will examine those in the next slide. Now, each region had their own plant, very similar to the way states have their own flowers. Upper Egypt's symbol was the flowering lotus, and there were many of those in those numerous deserts in Upper Egypt. Lower Egypt's plant was the papyrus plant, and of course those were near many of those rivers that fan out from the Nile to the Mediterranean. And both regions had different gods. The patron goddess of Upper Egypt was Nekhbet. Now, Nekhbet is often portrayed as a vulture. Now, Lower Egypt's patron goddess was Wadjet, and Wadjet is often portrayed as a cobra. Collectively, they were referred to as the Two Ladies. Now, after the pharaohs took over in 3100 BC and unified these two kingdoms, these two gods were still very important, and we can see that on King Tut's golden mask. We can see Wadjet portrayed on the right, and we can see Nekhbet portrayed on the left. And that represents the unification of the two kingdoms, which we will talk about in the very next video. Okay, that is going to do it for this video. I will see you guys in the next video when we will examine the unification of Egypt and the very first pharaohs, as well as the very first dynasty.